Alright YouTube, this is the second time I've done a review of Manson File, Myth and Reality of an Outlaw Shaman by Nicholas Schreck. In the first video, of course, I was actually suffering from a cold, so it didn't sound very good, so I decided to re-upload it for my own reasons. Basically, this is the book here, Nicholas Schreck at the top, of course, wonderful photographs. All of the illustrations, the photography and so forth in here is done by Xena. Of course, Nicholas wrote the book, and essentially it's the best book written on the subject of Charles Manson. It mainly will appeal to those who are interested in the case. To some extent, I think it would appeal greatly also to people who are just interested in true crime. Of course, the differences and similarities with other books within the genre, there have been dozens and dozens of books written about Charles Manson, about the case, about him, his actual life, about, the family dynamic and so forth. The connections in the case are vast, and dozens of books have been written on the subject. Most of them fall into the category of pulp fiction. Of course, Newell Emmons wrote Manson in his own words. Vincent Bugliosi marketed his book as this fair review of Manson, briefly covering his life, more, of course, focusing on the case than anything else. The problem with other books of this genre, and I've read Helter Skelter, and I've read part of Newell Emmons' book, and I've read passages from others. I've never been much interested in the whole pulp fiction aspect of the actual case. The problem is that most of these are written in one of two ways. They're either written in a semi-fictional tone, sort of a conspiracy theorist tone, that is that, Manson was involved in the Process Church, Scientology, Satanism, some religious group that Manson supposedly was involved in to a heavy extent, and they take that theme and they extrapolate it and they write a novel about it. The problem being there's not much subject material available for them to actually do that, because as this book does a good job of explaining, Manson's role involving Scientology or the Process Church or any of these other groups was limited in scope to short periods of his life, and usually only peripheral detail in the first place. So the problem with writing a book, of course, of 200, 300, 400 pages on the subject is that a very large amount of it just becomes fanciful. It becomes opinion. I would extend that to Helter Skelter as well, that it's written from the DA's perspective. And of course it won all sorts of awards because it was written fairly shortly after the case. It was worked on extensively, and Vincent Bugliosi put together this book. The problem is he wrote it all from his own prosecutorial experience. That is, he put his own opinion and words behind the actual case. The problem being, those of us who have studied the case more in detail understand many of the things that he said don't actually make sense. For instance, the idea that Manson somehow used LSD to brainwash his followers doesn't hold up to modern scrutiny. As we've seen once MKUltra came out, what we've seen is that you can't actually do these things. Some of the things which Bugliosi claims in his book aren't actually possible. What this book does is it does a great deal of work to dispel some of the myths in the case. Now, Schreck has worked with Manson. Some of the passages in this book are quoted as by Manson himself in letters to Nicholas Schreck. But from what I can understand reading the book and having spoken with him, is that he's not purely some ultra-Manson fan who thinks Manson is this god or great person who deserves to go off scot-free and go use drugs out in the desert. That is, that the case, the way Nicholas Schreck has looked at it in this book, and it's refreshing, quite refreshing, is that he actually looked at it from an objective point of view, and he actually apparently did enough research into the subject beyond simply reading Helter Skelter, taking a new slant on it and calling it a new book, which is what some authors regrettably have done. Some of the books are basically just a rehash of Helter Skelter. What Schreck did is actually speak with Manson, speak with people that are connected to the case, and make his own conclusions based on their speech, based on what they have said, which is something that other people haven't done. Now, of course, this is the updated edition. There is another version of the Manson file. It's smaller in size, it's much older, and you could, I guess, claim even outdated. This is full of new details, Some of the things cited in here come from within the last 3 or 4 years, which is also interesting because you've got to understand most of the books written about the Manson case and most of the documentaries that have been done about the Manson case are based on old material. They're based on the DA's arguments in the first place. They might go through court records, they might go through old interview archives, old film archives. They generally plagiarize one another's books extensively. This book doesn't actually do that, and in fact he refutes Bugliosi's claims in this book effectively by pointing out simplistic ways in which the case can be described which other people haven't actually taken notice of. For instance, the mafia drug connection. I've never seen that in any of the other books. Manson's alluded to it numerous times in interviews. Whenever he gets an interviewer that's actually willing to let him speak, he's willing to go into serious detail about the case. We saw that with Superstar. We saw that to some extent in the Ron Reagan interview, where he was actually given a platform to speak. Not necessarily an unbiased, fair platform, but at least given the chance to speak his mind without being interrupted constantly, like we saw with Geraldo or Tom Snyder. When Manson's actually given the ability to speak freely, he actually details a great deal about the case. The problem being he speaks in some obscure, somewhat arcane terms that most people don't understand, and they brush it off as psychobabble, as nothing but schizophrenic nonsense. This book does a good job of interpreting Manson's words in a realistic light and going deeper into what he's actually saying. Now, you can claim, of course, Manson's a madman, he's a psychopath, he's schizophrenic, he's any of these things, none of which have ever been actually proven. He was at Vacaville for years. They never showed him to have any specific mental defects at all, other than he's been locked up all of his life. But it goes into great detail in actually explaining the words in a coherent manner. Of course, Manson can be confusing at times. He can be incoherent. He's been in solitary confinement the better part of his life. We can give him a pass on being a little bit muddled and vague when it comes to the things that he's saying. But I highly, highly recommend this book, not to mention, in addition to the absolute breadth of coverage, all the way up from Manson's birth, his upbringing, every place he's ever been, every religious factor that's ever gone into his life, the case, the family dynamic, it's all here. This is literally a tome. This book, it runs to over 900 pages, and that's not including the complete discography in back of all of Manson's work, and that takes up a good 20-30 pages here. It's got every album Manson's material has ever appeared on. Actually, it's got some new things. I've studied the Manson case intensely, and I have never known about many of the albums that he's actually been in. There's one, Charles Manson's first record, from a band called Silverhorn, actually, where Eyes of the Dreamer appeared. And Silverhorn was an alias of Charles Manson's. That was from 1970. And this is actually the first one that he was on. I didn't know about this. The amount of material in this book, and this is perhaps the one negative aspect of this book. It's a very well-written book. Nicholas Schreck's sometimes wry, sarcastic humor I find hilarious. His sarcastic remarks towards groups he disagrees with is great. But the one thing I think people will find it a little bit daunting, perhaps, if they're not interested in true crime or the Manson case, or something at least loosely connected with the subject material, they may find it a little bit large for them, a little bit dense. It's written in a very formal style, from a very academic, learned perspective. It's certainly not like most of the books written on the subject, which are written in sort of this fictional tone, evoking psychotic imagery, evoking violent imagery, many times to a fault, garbage children or whatever. You know, it's just pulp fiction. It's not really real. It's a fictionalized account. Some of these are pure fiction, and some of these are fiction masquerading as truth. You don't get that with this book. You actually get the straight truth. Manson detractors would do well to read this as well, because even if you consider Manson a bad person, even if you consider him a dangerous schizophrenic psychopath, it still is the most authoritative look at the case. Even if you were to divorce the idea of the case from this book, it would still be an authoritative view, at least, of Manson's life and wanderings, which this goes into hundreds of pages of detail about, something nobody else has bothered to do, based partially, of course, on accounts from Manson, based partially on accounts found elsewhere. And I haven't quite finished the book. I'm almost through it now. That shows its great size. I'm usually a very quick reader, and this book is absolutely massive. It's more than worth the money. For a book of this size and this detail, anyone interested remotely in the Manson case or in crime in general, the 60s, conspiracy theories, the mafia ties into this, drug dealing, anything related to drugs. If you're interested in the history of, for instance, Satanism or Gnosticism, you'll find material in here about that as well, which ties right into the Manson case. A book that has something for a very large number of people that I think a lot of times, if we don't get the word out there about the book, and this is what I'm trying to do with this review, if we don't get the word out there, people will look at this and they'll say, oh, it's just about this crazy dude. It's not just about this crazy dude from California who murdered Sharon Tate and all the other things people imagine Manson did. It really relates to a great breadth of detail about the world at large that's never been covered before. And the material in here, again, it's very well written. I think people would find it infinitely interesting if they actually bothered to read it. So I've already written reviews on Amazon and eBay for the book. I gave it 5 stars because it's definitely worth it. I've read very few books that I'm actually this interested in. Most books that I've read, I either enjoy them because they're fiction and they're interesting to read, or I enjoy them because they're educating. This I can enjoy because it's educating. This is definitely not fiction. This is truth. And that's something that people too often go without on subjects such as this, because the media hypocrisy and the hype surrounding the case all but blocked realistic views of the case. Once you learn from this book about the actual true motives behind the case, who was responsible, who was involved, why the case played out the way it did, why the murders occurred the way they did, what helter-skelter meant, what piggies meant, why the blood on the walls, why these specific individuals. Once you find out why these things happened and how they went down, 2 things will strike you. Number 1, it's more mundane than you can possibly believe. It has nothing to do with this fantastic LSD trip, helter-skelter nonsense that Vincent Bugliosi jailed Manson for in the first place. So you'll find that out. Then you'll realize the crime connections involved in the case are almost more interesting than the helter-skelter myth. You won't be left with this dry-worded description of a totally mundane case of, well, you know, these people just died, the end. It goes into many, many pages more detail than that. You'll probably find the actual explanation of the murders, the real one, to be infinitely more interesting than the lies spread by the mass media. And again, I don't believe Manson was responsible for the particular murders at Cielo Drive and the La Biancas. I divorce myself from that. I am not a follower of Charles Manson. I'm not really a fan of Charles Manson. I do like his music. I do like his ecological views. I do think that he gets blamed for a lot more than he was actually responsible for. But an unbiased view of the case doesn't know any boundary between those who think Manson is the devil and those who somehow worship Manson and believe he's some reincarnation of Jesus Christ, because both sides are equally wrong. A realistic view of the case is as of Manson essentially uninvolved in the first murders and barely involved in the second round of murders, with most of the imagery and symbolism that went into them, the helter-skelter, the blood on the walls and so forth, being merely victimized circumstance involving other individuals at Spawn Ranch that have a long history, which this book describes as well, that people will find very interesting. So, major kudos to Nicholas Schreck and also to Xena for the wonderful pictures in here, and the pictures really are quite interesting. Can't be said enough how good this book actually is. It's very rare that I find a book that I'm actually willing to sit down and read it cover to cover without skipping most of it because it bores the shit out of me. This is one of those books that I'm not getting rid of. I'm getting rid of most of my books to make more room for other things. This won't be going into the sell pile, so to speak. Very, very well written book, and I hope that Nicholas Schreck makes more books on the subject, because if they're half as good as this, they'll be worth reading. Peace out.